Awesome. All right, I'll start us off. So welcome everybody to the third part of the web development series for Tableau coders. Today we've got some hopefully good stuff. I'm going to actually have Kyle doing most of the stuff today. So, better or worse, that's what we've got. Let's go ahead and go to the next page. You guys know us. I'm Zach. He's Kyle. We do stuff with data. We do stuff with development. That's it. Welcome to the initiative. If it is your first time, we'll tell you a little bit about it. If this is not your first time, you've probably heard us say this before. So to teach others to code with the Tableau APIs and developer tools while fostering a safe and friendly environment for users of all skills, skill levels rather. That is our mission statement. That is our goal. So, definitely, as Kyle mentioned, we have a very small group today. So I think we're gonna have plenty of time for dialogue, for questions, for any of that kind of stuff at the end. So, definitely let us know, and throughout the session if you have questions as well. We are, as mentioned earlier, in part 2. We are in the embedding API. Basically, web development is the key point of this part of the series. We're still working through that. This is kind of the middle piece. So expecting probably 5 episodes, just like we did for the REST API. If you did miss in the if you did miss the REST API or the first 2 episodes of the embedding API, you can find links to those on datatheories.com/Tableau coders. Updates.
I don't know if there's an update.
Yeah,
I was hoping the recordings from Data Dev Day would be available so we could share those. Zach and I both presented at Tableau's Data Dev Day a couple weeks ago. Haven't found the videos posted anywhere yet, but once we do, we'll make sure and share those.
Yeah, so hopefully here in a couple weeks when we have our next session, we'll have a lot more updates. We can share some stuff with you guys. Not much here, just a reminder that you can find all the latest information about the developer program at tableau.com/developer.
And we highly recommend coming in here and signing up for your developer sandbox if you haven't done that already. Once we get into more intense stuff with the embedding API, it'll help you practice a lot. So, all right.
Awesome. Quick recap. So, last session kind of was primarily me going through HTML, showing you guys a little bit of CodePen, which is an in-browser application that you can use to just check out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with low impact, very simple, easy way to play around with those kind of things. The session is available on YouTube. Again, it's available on datatheories.com. And we started building an interactive About Me resume page, which just basically showed some of the early concepts and beginning areas of HTML, and some embedding along the way of Tableau. Today, we're going to focus on CSS. And with that said, I'm going to pass it to Kyle. I have not seen what he's going to show us. It may be the best thing, it may be the worst thing, but we're going to pass it to him now.
All right. What a handoff. Thanks, Zach.
Yeah, could be okay. Go ahead.
Could be fine. All right. So good morning, everybody. So as Zach said, today we're going to focus on CSS. So what is CSS? I'm actually going to go back one page and talk about this diagram. So we talked about it in the last time, and one way to think about HTML versus CSS versus JavaScript, kind of the progression that we're on here. HTML, again, is kind of like the frame of your house, the walls themselves, the things that actually make up the structure of where you live, what the page looks like. CSS, what we're going to look at today, is you're going to start painting things, decorating things, arranging things in a programmatic way. So, and what we'll find is that you can do it so that you can reuse these things and share them across an entire application, things like that. And then next week, next session, we'll start turning the lights on and doing that kind of thing as well. So what is CSS? So I stole this definition directly from W3 Schools, but CSS is an acronym that stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and that cascading word will be really important, and we'll talk about that as we go through some of the examples. CSS describes how HTML elements are displayed on screen. It's also used in print media, just which I thought was interesting. It saves a lot of work, and you'll see that when we go through and start showing you initial stylings, and then when we switch to class and ID-based selectors, which will make sense in a minute, you'll see how much quicker and more scalable things can be using CSS than trying to style each individual element exactly the way you want it to. Another thing to call out, external style sheets, which we'll talk about as well, are just stored in .css files. So let's talk about CSS selectors. So when we get into CSS, you'll hear me talk about selectors a lot. And a selector is essentially an ID of an element, or it can be a class. And I'm called out down here that these are dots or hashtag notations, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, a selector tells the page the scope at which styling should be applied. And this is really important. The next point is important to remember that there are parent and child relationships here. And again, when I said the word cascading, when you apply things at the parent level, they cascade down to the children in specific ways. And it's important to understand that what is the parent and what are the child elements of any given part of your page, so that when you apply CSS, you understand how it's going to play out. And that'll make more sense as we go through some of these examples here. This is a lot of information on CSS selectors here from W3 schools, more than we could cover in this session. So if you want to read up, that's a good place to start on more information about selectors. So moving on, how do we use CSS? So I'm going to jump over to CodePen in a couple minutes and really dive in here. But I want to give a brief overview of 3 different things that we're going to see today. And that's the different ways that you can implement CSS. So the first most simple way would be referred to as inline. And inline means we're explicitly adding a style attribute to a div or a span, a certain element within our document. And then we are giving CSS roles in that same line. This gives you a lot of customizability. You can pick really anything and do exactly what you want to it. But generally, when you're building at scale, this is not encouraged. And you'll see why when we get into the examples. I see that we have a raised hand. So since we have a smaller group today, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, sir. So I want to understand this correct. Is CSS an enhancement of HTML? I mean, does it uses HTML to write or instruct? Is that correct?
Exactly. Not exactly. You can kind of think of them as more of partners. And CSS you could have a debate whether it's a language all its own. But CSS, when we get into it, it's really just attributes and values in key pairs. And when we see that here, or when I see that in CodePen in just a couple minutes, I think that'll make more sense. So it's not exactly HTML, but it works in conjunction with HTML to apply styling.
Okay, thank you.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah, I think once we get into it, and if you want to follow up on that question in just a couple minutes, we can do that as well. Internal at CSS, I will show another example of this as well. This is where we kind of extract it out into the head of our HTML document so that we can apply things across the entire document. But again, we would then have to do this on every page of our application if that's how we wanted to do it. So scalability is not best. And then external, similarly, but we're actually linking to an external style.css document. And so imagine in a scenario like that, if we had rules that we wanted to apply to every button, every headline across an entire web application, we could refer to the same style sheet once on every page and accomplish that. So that was a quick way, and I'm gonna show you these things here in just a moment. Quick note: I just talked about inline, and you're gonna hear me talk about inline in another context as well. I wanted to point out here that inline means a couple different things, and I'll get to a practical example in just a second. But when we talk about block versus inline elements, that is different than inline CSS. And I will point that out here in an example. So let's just dive on in. I'm going to open up a code pen. And I encourage folks to follow along with this one. So I'm going to post a link into the chat for some HTML that I'd like for you to copy. Get the chat open here. So if you want to copy this, oh, I didn't mean to copy that. That might be easier if I copy the URL. You can copy either that HTML or or copy it from the URL I just sent. But if I take this over into a code pen and paste that into the HTML section, we'll get rid of this for now and give us a little more room here and here. I can see that, I don't have a lot of styling going on. I have some differences in font size based on using H1s and H2s and H3s, which are just default HTML elements that come with some style on their own. But other than that, not a whole lot going on here. One thing that we didn't talk about last week that I want to point out here that becomes very important is the difference between block and inline elements in HTML. So if you see here, I've wrapped this H1 in a div. I've put a div around this set of spans. A div just stands for a division within a web page. It doesn't occupy any space on its own, but it can be molded around the things inside of it. And like we were talking about before, in this example, this div becomes the parent, and this H1 is the child. This div becomes a parent of all 4 of these elements. So when we get into cascading things, this is where we're talking about it's important to know how kind of the water will flow down. So another thing to point out here, you see that I don't have any line breaks added in here. There's nothing in here saying skip a line, give me some white space. But you can see just by their nature, divs create a new line. This is what we mean when we say that an element is a block element. It means it will occupy the entire line that it is on, or entire row is more accurate, the entire row that it is on, unless you specify otherwise. Spans, however, here, which is just a section of a larger element that you can style if you wish, are inline elements. And you can see here that even though in the code, I've created a line to give myself some readability, the spans themselves do not create line breaks between each other. And that's important to know. And it's something that you'll get accustomed to when you start working with different elements, is whether or not their default behavior is block or inline. So let's start manipulating some things here. So if I bring up what I want to show you here. So there's a couple different things we can do. So let's say I want to make this centered. Let's center this first div just because that I want to approximate a page here. First, I add a style tag, and then within this style tag or attribute, I can give it, like I was saying, key value pairs separated by a semicolon. And there are hundreds of different CSS options. I have a link later in the presentation about looking at a long list of them. So I'm just going to give some of the more popular ones and some that are a little bit more visible to really show what's happening here. But if within this style tag, if I give it an attribute called text align center, now, all of a sudden, without me doing anything else, this text jumps to the middle. If I want to say, let's just point out what space this is occupying, I can give it an attribute called border, which can take an argument for the type of line and the color. So if I do this, now I can see I have a red outline that shows me all of the space that is occupied by this div. I like to use borders when I'm building things because it helps kind of identify where things are and if they overlap or if they should. So I'm going to use borders to kind of display a few different things here. So now let's go into the second div. What if I want to look at this one and say, I don't want this one to occupy as much space as the other one. Let's first put a border around it so we can see what's going on here. So now I've got a blue border. I can see that this has this headline and these 3 spans inside of it. Okay, that's fine, but maybe I only want this div to take up half of the page. So I can put in a width of 50%. And then we will see that now this div is only 50% of its parent container, which in this case, the parent of this div is the body. So it's half the width of the entire body. Now, within these spans, I've got some different things that I can do if I want to take a look at these. So let's say that I want all of my text in this second div to be underlined. I can also add something to the text decoration of the parent, and that will make it so that everything within all of the child elements, also inherit this. But let's say I have a child that I want to treat specially, my special child that I want to treat a little bit differently. I can go in here and add additional selectors or additional attributes to one of the children, such as let's add some padding, give it a little bit extra space, and then, if I can get my fingers to work correctly, there we go. If I want to say, okay, I want this child and only this child to be green. So kind of silly examples, but just giving you kind of visual examples of what CSS can do. So now let's do one more thing with this third div down here. So let's say that I want this div to be in a very specific location on the page, which is sometimes what you want to do. You may want something to be floating at the top or the bottom. You may want it to be exactly a certain amount of pixels away from something else. So I can add a style here called position. And position can take either absolute or relative. So absolute in this case means I am giving it, as it sounds, an absolute reference to its parent. And relative would be a relationship to something else within the same parent. So if I want to say I want this to be exactly 25 pixels from the bottom, I can say position absolute, bottom 25. And now you can see this third div has jumped down to the bottom. And let's say we want to do, just to show off some of the more, this isn't necessarily practical, but some of the more interesting things that CSS can do. CSS has things called transformations, which let you twist, turn, apply effects, do transitions, or grow, shrink transitions, which I'll show an example of. But this is something that you can do with just a transform attribute. And I'm going to use a silly one here just because it's visual, but scale X, and I'm going to do -1. And what that does is it just mirrors the content of the div. So you can see here, now we've got our text mirrored. Again, silly example, but I think this does an okay job of showing just how much you can change the structure of a document using just CSS. So everything that I've shown just now is an example of inline CSS. And remember, that's where I'm just applying style tags directly to the elements that I want to change. Again, if I had, several pages that I wanted to apply the same thing to, or have them look the same way, then I would need to repeat this process for each element on each page. So probably not the best, right? If we're talking about reusability, scalability. So let's talk about how we can make this a little bit better. So instead
Excuse me, Kyle.
Oh, sure, go right ahead.
Is there a cheat sheet to where we can refer to many of these styles?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I know this is going a little bit fast, and I'm glad you're jumping in here. So this is the selector cheat sheet that I referred to. And if I will make sure that this list is included as well, but also from from W3 schools. There is a link here for CSS reference. I'll put this in the chat if you're interested. Now, I would never, as you keep going with this, there's going to be, you know, a handful of tags that you get to know really, really well and use most often. I wouldn't recommend trying to memorize them all. And more about get to know a few that you'll use a lot, and then you know, if you're curious, you know, I've probably not used half of them. There's a lot that you can do. CSS is extremely powerful. But good question, and I'll make sure that that's included with the notes for the next session. Yeah. All right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to take this and HTML and just clear it back out with what we've got here. So we're going to start over. So we're going to see now that we're back to where we started. So what I'm going to do now is add some IDs and some classes to these same elements so that we can show a more real world example of how you tend to use CSS. So for this div, I'm going to give it an ID called first div. And the standard notation for CSS, if anyone's curious, is lowercase words separated by a hyphen. And so then I'm going to jump down here. I'm going to give this one an ID of second div, very creative names. And then for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this one a class of third div. And I'm going to show the difference between the two here. So if I want to do this inline, I would add a style tag to my head like this. And then from then on, anything between the open and close of this style tag, the browser is going to interpret as CSS. So it's going to take that and apply it to anything that's in the document below. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a hashtag or a pound. And what that is telling CSS is search by ID. So typically you would use this if there's only one of an element with a given ID, otherwise it can get confusing. But what I can do here is I can say, okay, search by ID, that ID is first div. So now anything that I put in here, it's going to go, okay, here's an ID, or here's a div with that ID, apply these rules. So if I apply some of the same rules that I did before, so we'll do our border so that we can visually identify it. Now we've got that same border from before. And if I want to do my centered text again, or text align is center, and then I have that same result. I can do the same with second div. And then once we do a couple of these things, we'll show some other advantages of doing it this way. So I've got width is 50%, border, 1 pixel, solid blue. So now we'll have that same thing that we had before. So this is where things get interesting. So within this selector of second div, so again, the pound is saying find second div by ID. I can then say for any span, so what this notation means is within an element with ID second span, second div, any elements that are spans apply the following rules. So if we look at the HTML, just to point this out, so second div has 4 children. 3 of them are spans, 1 of them is an H2. So if I apply a rule this way, so I'll do text decoration underline. Now it looks through the through the second div and only applies this rule to the spans. So I can see now that my spans got underlined, but the div, the actual H3 did not. So if I want to take that a step further, CSS also has child selectors. So if I do second div, span, last child, and what that means is within the element with the ID second div, an element of span, the last one. And if I put in an attribute here, let's just say color green, you can see that my last span turned green. I can also do things like nth child. And what that means, what that will do is pick individual child elements. Now, this is a little bit of a funky example because there's an even number, but an odd number of children. So, but you can play around here and see that, okay, for the fourth child within this element that is a span should receive this. You can also do every other child. So you can do things like row banding is a good example of what you can do with these nth child selectors. So for now, I'm just going to leave that as it is. I can continue going on with third div doing, let's do just to finish it out here. We can do the same thing, position at absolute and oops, and bottom 25 pixels. All right, I did this on purpose. Notice nothing happened when I did this time. So before I gave these divs IDs, I first div, second div, and on the third div, I said when we were going through it, I'm going to give this a class instead. The notation for a class, instead of being a £, is a period. So in this case, this will give, oh, and I also spelled third wrong, but this classes can be applied to multiple elements at the same time. Meaning if I have a bunch of buttons, for example, I want all of them to look the same. I can create one class called submit button, or I can have a title, something like that. I'm not sure why that isn't updating. I must have done something on third div. Did I spell it wrong down here? Oh, I did. Here we go. Now we can see that that has updated. So obviously, I think the advantages here are pretty clear in terms of write it once it's done. Now, this is still bound to this page. So these styles that we've applied here, if I had another page with elements with similar IDs or similar classes, I would have to add this again and rinse and repeat for each one that I wanted to apply these to. But let's see what happens when we externalize this. So if I take this out of here, and for CodePen, this is a very easy visual example. So when I take all of that out, obviously we're back where we started. If I take that same CSS and paste it right here, now all of a sudden it applies to what we see without it being part of the HTML. And what that looks like in the real world, just to give an example, what CodePen is doing for us here is adding this line to what it renders. So we've got a link tag in our head. That relationship is a style sheet. And then we get the hyperreference, which is just the path to the CSS file. So this file is this, what you see on the right. So essentially, like I said, what CodePen is doing is creating a page that has this tag in its head, and that's what it's rendering for us here. But now to go back to that the example from before, if I wanted to apply all of these styles to all of the pages on my website or in my application, I could drop this into each file and be good to go. And even beyond that, the even bigger advantage would be if I need to change styles and I want them to cascade/apply to each page in my application, I only have to update them one place. So definitely recommend. Style tags are good as you're learning attributes. Internal CSS is good when you're trying to just line up, make sure you're understanding how things are fitting together. But using an external style sheet is kind of like would be called, considered the best practice, industry standard, things like that. There's going to be times where there are exceptions, always, but just a best practice there. All right. That was a lot, I know. I want to keep going. If there are any questions right now, happy to take questions on what we've seen so far. And then we're going to talk about a concept called flex. Anyone? Any questions for now? I'll keep going then. All right, so let's flex a bit. So what is Flex / Flexbox? So I remember a time before Flex in CSS when I was doing amateur web development in high school. And what Flex really allows you, we're Tableau people, right? So think about Flex as an analogy to a container on a dashboard. It creates a way for you to dictate how elements should fill the free space or shrink or not shrink, depending on what you want them to do, in a layout that is less directionally oriented. Like I was saying before, certain elements by default are either horizontal or vertical by nature, and Flex allows you to dictate what should rotate or what should occupy this much space given this set of points or set of scenario. What it also helps with is responsive elements. And what I mean by that is any website that you go to today, whether you're looking at it on a huge 4K monitor or on your phone, they have created a responsive layout for the most part, meaning that it knows how big your screen is and it will make certain changes to elements so that they look better. You know, you wouldn't want the same phone experience on a large monitor or vice versa. And Flex helps you do that by dictating what can grow, what can't, which directions things should go, etc. So Flex is a topic that we could honestly spend 8 hours on. So I encourage folks to check out, there's a blog post here that really talks about Flex and another popular layout system called Grid. They're both used pretty often these days. But Flex, I hope to show you more of the power of Flex and some of the basics. And then it hopefully something that we can grow and continue to talk about in future sessions as we create our application. So just a quick cheat sheet here. I'm not going to read all of this right now, but I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at this one. This is, I think, a really good representation of some of the more common things that you'll do in Flex. There's also some links over here. Flexbox Froggy is a fun little game that I think you don't really need to know anything about CSS. It walks you through how to, you're basically getting some frogs onto their lily pads and learning a bit about how Flex works. It's helped me multiple times, so I recommend that. And then there's another guide to some more tips and tricks on Flex. Flex is a very popular topic. If you Google it, you'll find lots of different things to kind of match your style. So I'm going to jump back over to CodePen again. And this time I've got another example that I want to have everyone follow along with. And so that is, we're going to go back to this interactive resume that we started last time. And so that is the link to the HTML. And I'm going to send, so I'm going to go a little bit fast on this. So if you want to follow along, I encourage that. If you would rather copy and paste what I'm going to do and just so that you can concentrate more on the explanation, totally fine as well. I sent that link. So let's jump back over here. Let me get the HTML in here and quickly just kind of walk through. Nope, not like that. Just quickly walk through what we did or where we are here. So this should probably look somewhat familiar. I changed a little bit of it just to point out some new things today. So this is our resume that we started on last week. And just a reminder, if you want to swap out your picture, you can just go to your LinkedIn, click on your photo, right click, copy image address, and then put that inside of this image tag. If you want to look at my face, that's fine, but I don't know why anyone would want to do that. So let's look. I've created a couple.
Here.
Thanks, Zach. I've created a couple new divs since the last time we saw this, and I think after those previous examples, we probably are starting to see why. And I will just walk through real quick the structure here. So we've got our outermost container. We've got our title section, which is this bit of text above the picture. We've got our profile image, our social links, which are down here, the about me, and then down at the very bottom, we have a little made up embedded viz. So I want to show you the difference we can make with just some CSS to this already existing HTML. So the first thing, I don't want the background of the page to be white like this. I want to have some contrast between the content and this. So I'm going to say the body tag. I want the background color to be, and I just know this color because it's very popular, but it's D3, D3, D3. That's what's called a hex code, so for 6. Those are used a lot in CSS. There's also a list of colors that you can use by name. So I could say black if I wanted the background to be black. I could say light gray. And actually, I'll just leave it on light gray. But if hex codes allow you to be a lot more specific, you know, there's only maybe I think about 32 or something like that colors you can do by name. Hex codes let you do the whole range. So let's start with our container, which is our outermost. What I want here, I want the background of this to be white because I want it to stick out from everything else. I want to give elements in this a little bit of room to breathe. So I'm going to give it padding. And you can see once I do that, everything's no longer crammed right into the corner. And that's actually, it's applied to all sides. I want to give this a shadow, and I'll show you what effect that ends up having. So this is an attribute called box shadow. What this takes is the number of pixels from the bottom, or sorry, the extending from the bottom, offset from the left, and then the blur. So if I do this, if I do it this way, so 2 pixels down from the bottom, offset 2 pixels from the left, and then the blur out 8 pixels. So you can kind of see this is given a feel of a card, a little bit of a floating effect. So I don't want this to take up the whole page though. I want this to look more like a card. And I'm going to say the max width in this case is 700 pixels. I could also do it as a percentage if I wanted to always occupy a certain proportional amount of the page. But for this example, we'll just stick with that. I am going to say display flex here because I want its children to react in a flex manner. You can see as soon as I do that, everything jumps up here. And that's because the default behavior of flex is for it to be by row. But in this case, since I'm building a vertical orientation here, I want to change this to flex direction column. And now you can see that everything's starting to looks a little bit more like it should. We'll deal with the image sticking over the side in a minute. So I'm going to add another couple of things here. I want this content to be centered vertically within this, and I want it to be centered horizontally within this as well. So I'm going to say align content and justify content. And then just as a little finishing touch, I'm going to add what's called a border radius, which is going to help me just round the corners a little bit. So as soon as I add a border radius, let's actually bump that up a little bit so it's a little more obvious. If I add a border radius here, now you can see that I have a nice rounded edge on these, which is very popular these days versus squares. So now I formatted our outer container. Let's move on to the title. So you can see here that I have a div called title. So I'm going to add, again, by this ID, title. And I'm going to say display flex. Flex direction is going to be column once again. And then I also want this content justified center alignment. So now, once I do that, we can see that I've got, actually that didn't make much of a difference because I have some spans with some classes in here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to copy and paste some of these in and I'll walk through them that way. So I've got a class here called resume title. And I'm saying within that, I want it to be centered. I want the font size to be 32. The font weight, which is, you can think of it as bold versus thin, is 600. The default is 500. So just made this a little bit more bold. And I've added some padding to the bottom to give it some room to breathe. Next thing we're going to look at is the subtitle class. So if I copy this over, now we're looking at this line, hey, at least I'm not Zach, the most important line. And I said, again, I want this in the center because it's like a headline. The font size a little smaller than above. and font style is italic. So that's, you create a italic or underline, strike through, things like that that you might want to add to a text element. That's how I would make that happen. Moving on to our profile image. So I have a div with that ID. So the first thing I want to do is address that. So not a whole lot you can see that happened here because the image is too big. But I'm also setting flex within this div and centering the image. Once I get back, sorry, my screen moves here, profile image. The next thing I want to do within the profile image section is actually change the image to make it fit within the space and gussy it up a little bit here. So some of these tags we're getting a little bit obscure, but what I'm saying here with this object fit is that I do not want the image to extend outside of its parent, so contain it within its parent, which again is the div called profile image. I want it to be a maximum width of 100%. So again, I don't want it to extend beyond where it should. And in this case, I don't want it to be any taller than 400 pixels. Okay. And then we've got these two actually aren't needed. And then I've got a border radius here as well, so that we get some rounded corners on the image. You could take it really extreme and make it like an avatar type circle image. And then that text align center, it's not right here anyway. So now we can see, we've got what was just a bunch of lines crammed together with no styling and an image that was too big. Now we've got a headline, a subline, or a subtitle, a rounded sized image, all through CSS. So let's move on to social links. And this is where we can start seeing some big differences. So I'm going to do these one chunk at a time. So I've given social links here. I've made it flex as well. And I've given this justify content here I've been doing center. Now, in this case, I want these to be equidistant from each other and from the sides. So I can do space evenly. But what if I wanted them to hug the right side? I could say flex end. Or if I wanted them to hug the left side, I could do flex start. So that is in the image that I sent before. That's these are some of the more common things that you'll see in Flex. I'm going to put these back in the middle for now. I'm aligning them in the center vertically, and I gave them a little bit of padding. Now let's copy in the next couple of things at a time. So if we look at within social links, each one of these is a span that has a link in it. So, and the span has a class called social button. So without any styling, they just look like normal links because the spans themselves don't bring along any additional information. When I add in some additional styling here, which all I've said here for the links is make them, this is a shorthand for white. I could also just do white. Text decoration none, so remove the underline. And then I can start styling the spans. So I've made the span itself an inline flex, which just means flex within flex. I've centered things each direction. I've made the background color something that reminds us more of a button. And then I've given some width properties. I don't want it to be too big. I want it to have some margins. I've given it a height. And again, I've rounded off the corners. So, I mean, that's cool. Those start to look like buttons. But what can we do to make them act like buttons? And that's where a really useful feature of CSS called pseudo classes comes in. And that's when you see something that starts with a colon and usually a keyword. So if looking at this, it's pretty easy to understand, I think, what's going to happen here. This is saying for any span within the element with ID social links, on the hover event, make the background gray. So most of the time, the background is this blue color. But when I hover now I get things that are actually reactive. So I can start making things that act like buttons without actually putting buttons in there. I can do all kinds of stuff with that. So if we move into the About Me, and I'm going to do this one all at once, and then we'll talk about it. We can show how you can turn something that would normally just look like a bulleted list into something very different. So I've taken our unordered list, our UL tag, and our list item tags, and I've applied quite a bit of styling to them. So the About Me section itself, we're just setting up our flex. We're adding a little bit of padding. I'm adding that the title should be 100% width. And then I start styling the H3, which is the title itself. So I've given it 24 pixels of space. Now let's look at what we did to the list here. So our unordered list in the About Me section, list style type, that's how I can control the bullets. So I can have squares or circles, or you can customize it even further. But in this case, I'm saying none. I don't want any bullets. And in this case, I don't want any padding or margin. I want it to be an inline flex, and I want to space them evenly. So now I've got what is actually a list ordered horizontally and with the items spaced evenly within their container. I've done some styling on the items themselves, so font size and padding, and again, border radius to round out those corners. Now you won't see that yet, but in just a moment, we'll see what that border radius actually does. In the list item hover for this section, I've added another background color. This is that same light gray color. And I've added a transform. We saw a transform with scale X before, which flipped things on its X axis. This is a scale, so it'll make things larger or smaller. It is based on percent as a decimal. So this is equal to 120%. So this section says, when I hover over a list item in this element, I want you to change the background color, and I also want you to scale it to 120% of its normal size. The next tag here, next attribute here, says how long should that transition, should the transform transition last? You can go really long, you can go really short. By default, there is no transition, so it'll just pop and then pop back. But if you want it to have a little bit of an animated feel, then you can add a transition duration. Typically, a quarter second to a half second is enough. So now what happens? So now when I hover over these list items, they grow, and they kind of, let me get rid of that. They grow both their actual size and the text within them. So this might not be the most practical thing in the world, but there are use cases where you might want elements to grow like a gallery of some kind when you are hovering over an image, or a carousel type thing, or even navigation buttons. You might want them to grow a little bit so the user knows that they can interact with them. So one thing I want to show is just by doing the hover, what ends up happening is I get this hover, but you can see that when I remove the hover, it just pops right back. So if I want to counteract that, I can combine pseudo classes with not hover. And so what that will say is scale me back to 100% in that same quarter second. And now I get more of a smooth, it animates in, it animates out. And then last but not least, and then we'll get to some questions, let's style our Tableau viz, which is our very last div in our card here. And I'll add that in. Not doing a whole lot here, just kind of centering it, giving it some padding. I added a little bit of a blue shadow here just to kind of show the styling that's going on here, again, with that box shadow. And then a border radius to show, again, some curved lines. Not necessarily how we would style this if we were going to show it to everyone. Again, more just focusing a lot on the visual impacts that CSS can make. So again, I know that was fast. I encourage everyone to look through the links that I shared from GitHub, and there will also be all of it will also be in the, it is already all on GitHub. So if you want to look through the entire repo from today, that's there. And this is just to show you, again, what we went from and what we did without updating anything but CSS. And there we go. Code is already available. There's the link. There's also links in the chat as well. And for the next session, which will be July 14th. So 2 weeks from today. Homework, if you want, practice some of these on your own, look through the repo links that I shared, reach out if you have questions. You know, this was a lot. CSS, there are people whose entire job is CSS and they spend years mastering it, but it is something that is very approachable if you put it in context. You know, find something you like, find something you care about, and play around with it. And in the next session, we're going to be getting started with JavaScript. So what we've been talking about, our house analogy, we're going to hook up the appliances. We're going to turn the lights on, make stuff start happening. And that will get us ready to build our full embedded experience with the Tableau API and finish out our series with a bang. So, Zach, did you have anything to add before we open it up for questions?
No, I'll keep it friendly. It was great.
You have opinions.
I always have opinions, especially when it comes to you, Kyle. But it was fine. It was fine. We did some stuff. There were things that happened.
Always so encouraging.
Try to inspire where I can. No, I think that's it. Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate you going through that. Does anybody have any questions for our last 7 minutes or so?
Yeah, feel free to just come off mute. No one? Anyone?
Hey guys, this is Pam Bell.
Hi, Pam.
I just wanted to say that when I was a long time ago, learning to be a webmaster, quote unquote, which actually I was thinking when on the data dev day the other day, Kyle, when you said full stack developer, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what they call it now.
Yeah, we used to be called webmasters.
Yeah. So anyway, at the time I was learning, at some point I came across the website CSS Zen Garden, and I'll put that in the chat.
Yes,
It's just the coolest thing because it's got they give you the HTML, the content, the context, and people just change up the CSS and images. So it's the exact same content on each of them, but it's styled differently through CSS. So if someone's having a hard time understanding what CSS is doing or capable of, this will show you it's the exact same content on every page, just different styling.
Yeah, this is cool. Yeah. Thank you, Pam. Awesome. Anyone else have any questions, feedback? You want to throw something at us or Zach specifically?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Is it okay to share my screen?
Yeah, let me stop sharing. I might have to make you a host.
All right.
Do you have the option to share your screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
So but it looks that it's impossible.
I just made you a host. Try one more time. I just made you a host.
Okay, it works. Yeah, this is check. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Sample code. So this is the one I created the last time. Interactive resume. Maybe.
Sorry. We saw your code pen for a second, but now we see Tableau.
Okay. All right. So let me check. About this.
Yes. Now we've got.
Okay. Right. This is the one I tried to do. The last time I created the interactive resume, and I hope to fit my visualization in a little bit smaller because my visualization is too big for now. So isn't any way to fix the width and hide smoothly or shrink it with HTML or CSS?
So if you're talking about the embedded viz itself, not really. So you can define the amount of space that the container that your viz is in will take up, but then you're gonna get scroll bars within your viz. What you could do within the viz itself is set up different layouts for different widths so that Tableau detects like, okay, I'm in a width this big, react to it. There are ways that you can apply zoom to different elements, but I wouldn't do that because it's a little messy. What I would do is either build additional layouts for your viz, or just adjust the dimensions of your dashboard to fit where you're working. And that is something that would be really nice. But like by the nature of it, Tableau won't make things smaller unless it has a layout that accommodates that.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this thing I love doing, and that's telling Kyle that he's wrong. It's really one of my favorite things. So you can make a dashboard responsive without making any changes to it. It just is a URL parameter. I'm trying to look for the URL parameter. I'll send it your way, Rico, once I find it.
That Zach teaching us all things today.
That's what I'm here for.
All right. Well, we do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we are coming up to the bottom of the hour. But thank you, everyone, so much, as always, for spending a Friday morning with us. Hopefully, you found at least something in there helpful and valuable, and we will keep this going on our next session in 2 weeks. I'll get the video posted to YouTube as soon as possible. The event for July 14th is already out on usergroups.com or usergroups.tableau.com. So go ahead and get your RSVP in now. So you'd be ashamed if you forgot, right? Although how could you forget, but still. So yeah, with that, we will go ahead and wrap. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Friday, a great weekend, and a great 4th of July, if you're in the US. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.